Welcome to a nightmare that began on an ordinary day in a place of quiet contemplation, where the only thing that should have been feared was a paper cut. The dust of ages was Elias Thorne's companion. It danced in the pale yellow sunbeams that slanted through the tall, arched windows of the Havenwood Public Library, illuminating the quiet world he so carefully curated. He loved the smell of the place, a dry, sweet perfume of aging paper, buckram glue and lemon polish. It was a scent of stability. It was a scent of order. In a life that had offered little of either, the library was his sanctuary, a fortress of silence and stories against the chaos of the outside world. For 15 years, Elias had been the head librarian, a title that felt far too grand for a man who simply oversaw the hushed shuffling of pages and the gentle thump of returned books. He was a creature of routine. He arrived at 8, brewed a pot of Earl Grey tea, and walked the stacks, his fingers ghosting over the spines as if greeting old friends. He knew the library's secrets. He knew the loose floorboard in the history section, the window in the reference room that rattled in the wind, and the exact shelf in fiction where the afternoon light hit just so, making the gold lettering gleam like treasure. This day, a Tuesday in the heart of a crisp October, was no different. The air outside carried the first real bite of autumn, and the maple trees lining the town square were a riot of crimson and gold. Inside, the library was warm and still. Only a handful of patrons dotted the long oak tables. Mrs. Gable poring over gardening encyclopedias, 2 students whispering over a textbook, and old Mr. Abernathy, asleep behind a newspaper, his soft snores a gentle rhythm in the quiet. It was in the basement, a place Elias rarely ventured, that the routine was broken. A pipe had burst over the weekend, a slow, steady leak that had soaked a corner of the archives. He had spent the morning with a mop and bucket, the smell of damp earth and mildew clinging to his tweed jacket. The archives were a necropolis of forgotten things. Town records dating back to Havenwood's founding, decades of local newspapers turning brittle and yellow, and boxes of donated books deemed too obscure or damaged for the main collection were present. As he shifted a stack of water-damaged ledgers, his hand brushed against something else. It was a book, tucked away on a low, forgotten shelf behind a row of tax documents from the 1920s. It was not boxed or wrapped like the other donations. It was just there, as if it had been waiting. There was no dust on it. That was the first thing he noticed. In a room where every surface wore a thick grey coat of neglect, this book was pristine. He pulled it out. It was heavy, bound in a material he did not recognize. It was dark, a deep, lusterless black that seemed to drink the light from the single bare bulb overhead. It felt strangely soft, almost yielding like cured leather, but the texture was wrong. Too fine, too smooth. He ran a thumb over the cover and a shiver, cold and sharp, traced a path down his spine. It felt unnervingly like skin. There was no title, no author, no markings of any kind on the cover or the spine. It was a void, a black rectangle in his hands. He opened it. The pages were thick, vellum-like, and startlingly white against the black binding. They were filled with elegant, spidery script in a language he could not identify, the ink a strange, rusty brown. But it was the illustrations that made his breath catch in his throat. They were anatomical sketches, but horribly wrong. Skeletons with too many joints, organs arranged in impossible configurations. There were botanical drawings of plants that looked like tangled knots of veins and thorns, their blossoms like screaming mouths, and there were architectural diagrams of familiar Havenwood buildings, the town hall, the old clock tower, the library itself, but subtly altered, a doorway where none existed, a window that looked out onto a black starless sky, a staircase that seemed to twist back on itself, descending into nothing. He felt a sudden, intense wave of vertigo. The air in the basement grew heavy, thick and cold. The smell of damp mildew was suddenly replaced by something else, something cloying and metallic, like old blood. He slammed the book shut. The sound was flat and dead in the enclosed space. His heart was hammering against his ribs, a frantic bird trapped in a cage. He stood there for a long moment, the strange book in his hands, listening to the drip, drip, drip of water from the damaged pipe. The sound was no longer mundane. It was menacing. Each drop seemed to mark a passing second in a countdown he did not understand. Just an old medical text, he muttered to himself, his voice sounding hollow and unfamiliar, or some sort of artistic project. A morbid one, but nothing more. He tried to rationalize it, to fit it into the neat, ordered categories of his world. But the feeling would not go away. A deep, primal wrongness emanated from the book, a silent hum of malice that made the hairs on his arms stand on end. He should have put it back. He should have thrown it in the bin with the ruined ledgers and forgotten it ever existed. But he did not. He was a librarian, a keeper of stories. This book, whatever it was, held a story he felt a sudden, desperate need to understand. He carried it upstairs, tucking it under his arm as if hiding it from unseen eyes. Back in the warm, sunlit safety of the main floor, the book seemed less threatening. Just an oddity, an enigma. He placed it on his desk behind the circulation counter, the black cover a stark hole in the pleasant clutter of date stamps and overdue notices. He tried to go about his day. He helped Mrs. Gable found a book on hybridizing roses. He gently woke Mr. Abernathy at closing time. However, his eyes kept drifting back to the book. In the fading afternoon light, he could have sworn he saw a flicker of movement on its cover, a subtle ripple, as if something was stirring beneath the surface. He blinked, and it was still. Just a trick of the light. It had to be. That evening, he took the book home. The decision felt less like a choice and more like a compulsion. As he locked the heavy oak doors of the library behind him, the evening seemed darker than usual. The streetlights of Havenwood cast long, distorted shadows that writhed and twisted like living things. The familiar walk to his small cottage on Elm Street, usually a peaceful 10-minute stroll, felt fraught with a new and nameless anxiety. Every rustle of leaves in the wind sounded like a footstep behind him. Every creak of a branch sounded like a whisper. His house was like his library, small, ordered and quiet. Books lined every wall, a testament to a life spent in the company of words. He made a simple dinner of soup and toast, but he had no appetite. The book sat on his dining table, a silent, brooding guest. He could not bring himself to open it again. Not yet. He could feel its presence from across the room, a palpable weight in the silence of the house. He called Lena Petrova. She was a local historian, a sharp, inquisitive woman who knew more about Havenwood's strange past than anyone. If anyone could identify the script or the purpose of such a bizarre volume, it was her. Elias, to what do I owe the pleasure? Her cheerful voice crackled over the line. Lena, hello. I found something today. In the library archives. He tried to keep his voice even, to betray none of the unease that was coiling in his gut. An old book, uncatalogued. I was hoping you might be able to help me with it. Ooh, a mystery, my favorite. What does it look like? He described it as best he could. The black, skin-like cover, the lack of a title, the strange, rusty brown ink and the disturbing illustrations. There was a pause on the other end of the line. When Lena spoke again, the cheerfulness was gone from her voice, replaced by a note of caution. Black cover. You said it felt like skin. Yes, it is an odd description, I know, but it is the only one that fits. And the drawings. You said they showed parts of the town. Yes, but wrong. Another pause, longer this time. Elias could hear the faint sound of pages turning in the background. Elias, she said, her voice low, there are old stories, town legends. Most of it is nonsense, of course, ghost stories to scare children. But there are whispers about a book, a grimoire, some called it, bound in shadow and ink made of sorrow. They said it was a record keeper, not of what was, but of what was to come, a dark mirror of the town. Elias felt a cold dread wash over him. What kind of record keeper? They said it showed things that were going to happen, or things that could happen, calamities, sickness, death. It was called the Gloomwood Grimoire. Of course, it is just a folk tale. But she did not sound convinced. Where did you say you found it again? In the basement, behind some old tax records. I see. Listen, Elias, I would love to take a look at it, but maybe you should just put it back where you found it. Some stories are better left on the shelf, you know. Her words, meant to be comforting, had the opposite effect. The rational part of his brain screamed at him to listen to her, to take the book back to the library in the morning and bury it in the darkest corner of the archives. But another part of him, a morbidly curious part, refused. I will bring it by your shop tomorrow, he said, his voice more resolute than he felt. Just for a look. All right, Elias, but be careful. The line went dead. He sat in the silence, the book watching him from the table. Be careful. The warning echoed in the quiet room. Careful of what? A book. It was absurd. He was a man of logic and reason. He would not be spooked by small-town ghost stories. He resolved to ignore it. He picked up a novel from his armchair, a comfortable, familiar mystery, and tried to read, but the words on the page were a meaningless jumble. His mind kept returning to the black book. He could feel its pull, a silent siren song promising forbidden knowledge. Finally, he gave in. He walked to the table and with a trembling hand opened it again. He turned the pages slowly, his earlier revulsion now mingled with a fearful fascination. He stopped at a page that showed an illustration of a tree. It was a massive, gnarled oak, its branches like skeletal fingers clawing at the sky. At its base, there was a small, dark shape. A dog. It was lying on its side, its body twisted at an unnatural angle. He recognized the tree. It was the old oak in Miller's Field, on the edge of town, a landmark. He stared at the drawing for a long time, a knot of ice forming in his stomach. He closed the book, his hands clammy. The phone rang, shattering the silence. The sound was so sudden, so violent, that he gasped and dropped the book. It hit the floor with a soft, fleshy thud. He stared at it for a second before snatching up the receiver. "Hello?" His voice was a croak. There was nothing but static, a loud, rushing sound, like a storm over an empty ocean. He was about to hang up when a voice broke through, faint and distorted, as if coming from a great distance. A single word, "soon." Then the line went dead. He stood frozen, the receiver pressed to his ear, listening to the dial tone. His heart was a frantic drum against his ribs. It was probably a crossed line, a prank call. There were a dozen logical explanations, but logic felt like a flimsy shield against the encroaching darkness. A scratching sound came from the front door. Elias flinched. He put the phone down, his movements stiff and slow. He crept to the door, his ears straining. The scratching came again, more insistent this time. Frantic, he peered through the peephole. It was Sheriff Brody's beagle, Buster. The dog often roamed the neighborhood and sometimes stopped by Elias's cottage for a treat. But something was wrong. Buster was not whining or wagging his tail. He was clawing at the wood, his eyes wide with a terror Elias had never seen in an animal before. He opened the door a crack. Buster tried to force his way in, whimpering, his body trembling. "Hey boy, what is it?" Elias knelt. Buster did not look at him. He kept looking back down the dark street, a low growl rumbling in his chest. Elias followed his gaze. There was nothing there, just the empty street, the swaying trees, the pools of orange light from the street lamps. He coaxed the dog inside and closed the door, bolting it. Buster immediately scrambled to the back of the house, hiding under the kitchen table, shivering violently. Elias went to the window and looked out again. The street was still empty, but the feeling of being watched was overwhelming. He felt 1,000 unseen eyes on him from the darkness between the houses, from the black canopy of the trees. He pulled the curtains shut, his hands shaking. He spent the rest of the night in his armchair, a lamp burning beside him, refusing to let the house fall into complete darkness. He did not read. He just sat and listened to the sounds of the old house, the groans of the pipes, the creak of the floorboards, sounds he had heard 1,000 times before. But tonight, they were different. They were not the familiar groans of a house settling. They sounded like footsteps, like whispers, like something moving in the walls. Sometime after midnight, The scratching started again. It was not at the door this time. It was coming from the attic. A slow, methodical, scraping sound. Scrape. Pause. Scrape. It was the sound of something patient, something persistent. Elias sat bolt upright, every muscle tense. He told himself it was a raccoon, a squirrel, but he knew, with a certainty that chilled him to the bone, that it was not an animal. The scratching stopped. Silence descended again, thick and suffocating. He held his breath, waiting. A single soft thump came from the ceiling directly above his head, as if something had just been dropped. He did not sleep. He sat in his chair until the first grey light of dawn crept through the edges of the curtains, the black book lying on the floor where he had dropped it. When the sun finally rose, painting the sky in pale shades of pink and orange, the fear receded, but it did not disappear. It lingered, a cold residue in the corners of the room. He had to get ready for work. He had to pretend that this was just another day. He went into the kitchen. Buster was still huddled under the table, refusing to come out. As Elias prepared his tea, his eyes fell on the local newspaper. Delivered an hour earlier, he unfolded it on the counter. The headline on the front page made the teacup slip from his numb fingers and shatter on the floor. Tragedy in Miller's Field. Beloved, pet killed in freak accident. Beneath the headline was a photograph. It showed a distraught family standing next to a massive, gnarled oak tree. At the base of the tree, covered by a small tarp, was a familiar shape. The article said the dog, a golden retriever named Gus, had been found that morning. The vet could not explain it. The body was twisted, the bones broken, but there were no signs of an attack. No marks on the body at all. It was as if it had simply fallen from a great height. The shards of the teacup crunched under his shoes like tiny bones. Elias stared at the photograph in the newspaper, his mind a hollow chamber where logic and reason had died. The gnarled oak, the grieving family, the grim, tarp-covered lump at the base of the tree. It was the drawing made real. A perfect, horrible transcription from rust-brown ink to flesh and blood. The book did not just depict things. It decreed them. A low whine came from under the kitchen table. Buster was a shivering ball of tan and white fur, his eyes fixed on Elias, pleading. Pleading for what? Reassurance, protection. Elias could offer neither. He was an anchor that had come loose from its moorings, adrift on a black sea of impossibility. He swept the ceramic fragments into a dustpan, his movements robotic. He made another cup of tea, his hands shaking so badly that the hot liquid sloshed over the rim, scalding his fingers. He barely felt it. The pain was distant, a minor signal from a body that was already overwhelmed. He had to go to work. It was the only thing he could think to do. Routine was the wall he had built against the world, and now he scrambled to hide behind its crumbling facade. He picked up the grimoire from the floor. It felt heavier now, weighted with the truth of what it was. He wrapped it in a canvas tote bag, the black cover pressing against the thin fabric, a patch of absolute darkness. Leaving it here was not an option. He could not bear the thought of it being in his house while he was gone, a silent malevolence waiting in the empty rooms. He could not bear the thought of being separated from it either. It was a poison, but he was the only one who knew it existed, and he felt a terrifying, unwilling sense of responsibility. Buster refused to go outside. When Elias opened the door, the beagle backed away, growling low in its throat at the bright, harmless-looking morning. Elias had to call Sheriff Brody, his voice a strained, unfamiliar thing, and explain that Buster had shown up terrified last night and would not leave. Brody, his voice thick with sleep, just chuckled. He does that sometimes. Scared of his own shadow, that one. I will swing by and pick him up later. Thanks for looking out for him, Elias. Elias hung up the phone. Scared of his own shadow? No. He was scared of the thing that cast the shadows. The walk to the library was a journey through a landscape that had been subtly corrupted. The familiar houses on Elm Street seemed to lean inward, their windows like vacant eyes. The vibrant autumn leaves that littered the sidewalk looked less like nature's confetti and more like dried blood. He saw things he had never noticed before. A crack in the pavement that looked like a screaming mouth, the way the branches of a weeping willow scraped against a bedroom window, like fingernails on glass. A child's doll, left on a lawn, its plastic eyes staring into the empty sky. He felt watched. It was the same feeling from the night before, but the sunlight offered no protection. The gaze was brazen now, cold and appraising. It came from every darkened window, every alleyway, every passing car. He clutched the tote bag to his chest, the hard corners of the book digging into his ribs. He was being irrational. This was his town. These were his neighbors. However, the book had changed his perception, peeled back a layer of reality to show the grinning skull beneath. When he reached the town square, he could not bring himself to look at the library's clock tower. He kept his eyes fixed on the ground, unlocked the heavy oak doors, and slipped inside, the familiar scent of paper and polish doing little to soothe his frayed nerves. The library was no longer a sanctuary. It was a stage. He had the terrible feeling that the play had already begun. The morning passed in a blur of forced normalcy. He checked books in. He reshelved returns. He answered questions with a polite smile that felt like a mask cracking on his face. He kept the tote bag with the grimoire under his desk, but he could feel its presence radiating outwards, a cold spot in the warm, quiet room. Several times, he thought he heard a whisper, a sibilant breath just at the edge of his hearing. Each time he looked up, the library was still, the few patrons lost in their own worlds. It was just the wind, he told himself. The old building settling, but the excuses were wearing thin. Around 11, a young woman approached the circulation desk. She was a college student, he guessed, with bright, intelligent eyes and a cascade of dark, curly hair. He had seen her in the library a few times before, usually in the local history section. "Excuse me," she said, her voice soft but clear. "I was wondering if you could help me. My name is Maya. I am a folklore student at the university." "Elias Thorne," he replied, his own voice sounding rusty. "How can I help?" I am doing a paper on vanishings in small New England towns. Not just people, but things. Periods of time where records go missing. Stories that just stop. Havenwood has a few of those gaps. I was wondering if you had any materials, maybe in the archives, that are not in the public catalogue. Old journals, town meeting minutes that were never officially filed, that sort of thing. Elias felt a jolt, as if she had reached into his chest and touched the cold heart of his fear. Gaps. What sort of gaps? Maya leaned forward, her expression earnest. Well, for instance, there is a whole month missing from the town charter records in 1888, just gone. And there are stories about the old mill, about a whole crew of workers who just walked off the job one day and were never seen again. The official report says it was a labor dispute, but the local stories are much stranger. They talk about a sound that came from the woods. The woods. Lena had mentioned the gloomwood. He felt a bead of sweat trickle down his temple. I am not sure we have anything like that. The archives are mostly municipal records, tax ledgers. Anything, she insisted gently. Even rumors. Sometimes that is where the real story is hiding. He looked into her curious eyes and saw a reflection of the same compulsion that had made him take the book home, the need to know. The pull of the abyss. He wanted to warn her. He wanted to tell her to leave Havenwood, to find a different town for her paper, a town that was not sitting on a bed of sleeping horrors. I can look, he said instead, but I cannot make any promises. She gave him a grateful smile that did not reach his conscience. Thank you. I will be over in the history section. As she walked away, he felt a fresh wave of dread. The book was not just affecting him. It was a magnet, drawing in those who were attuned to the town's hidden frequencies. Maya, with her research into vanishings and whispers, was a moth drawn to a flame she could not see. He could not wait any longer. He had to go to Lena's. He told his part-time assistant, a high school student named Ben, to watch the front desk. He grabbed the tote bag and headed for the door, forcing himself not to run. Lena Petrova's shop, Havenwood Curios, was a dusty, overstuffed treasure chest tucked between a bakery and a hardware store. The bell above the door chimed as he entered, the sound swallowed by the dense clutter. Every surface was covered with the town's discarded past. Tarnished silver, faded photographs, Civil War-era tools and books. Stacks and stacks of books, their spines cracked and their pages foxed with age. Lerna was in the back, a pair of spectacles perched on the end of her nose, carefully mending the spine of an old atlas. She looked up as he approached, and her friendly smile faded when she saw his face and the canvas bag clutched in his hand. Elias, you look like you have seen a ghost. Something worse, I think, he said, his voice barely a whisper. He placed the bag on her work table. She did not touch it. The book. It was not a question. He nodded, his throat tight. He told her everything. The drawing of the dog under the oak tree. The newspaper article that morning. The strange phone call. The scratching in his attic. The feeling of being watched. He laid out the events of the last 18 hours, the words tumbling out of him in a frantic, disjointed narrative. Lena listened without interruption, her expression growing more grave with every word. When he was finished, she remained silent for a long time. She walked to the front door and flipped the sign to closed. Then she went to a small sink in the corner and began to scrub her hands, meticulously, methodically. Finally, she pulled on a pair of white cotton archivist's gloves. Only then did she reach into the tote bag and carefully slide the grimoire onto the table. In the shop's dim amber light, the book seemed even more malevolent. The black cover seemed to writhe, the smooth skin-like texture catching the light in a way that suggested a subtle, shallow breathing. Lena stared at it, her face a mixture of academic curiosity and primal fear. "The Gloomwood grimoire," she said softly, more to herself than to Elias. "I always thought it was a metaphor, a story the first settlers told to personify the hardships of this place. The harsh winters, the sicknesses, the disappearances." She opened it, and Elias flinched, instinctively taking a step back. Lena's breath hitched. She traced a gloved finger over the spidery rust-brown script, her brow furrowed in concentration. "This script, it is not one language," she murmured. "It is a chimera. I see some runes here, the old Futhark. And this looks like a bastardized form of Aramaic. And this is nothing I have ever seen. It is pictorial, almost alive." She turned a page to one of the anatomical drawings, the one of a human rib cage that seemed to spiral inward like a seashell. "The legends say the book is not from here, that it was found here by the first settlers when they cleared the forest to build Havenwood. They called the forest Gloomwood. They said the trees grew too close together, that the canopy was so thick it blocked out the sun even at noon. They said things lived in there, things that had been old when the hills were young. The air in the shop grew cold. The smell of old paper was overpowered by the same faint metallic scent Elias had noticed in the library basement. The settlers tried to destroy the book," Lena continued, her voice dropping lower. "They tried to burn it, but the pages would not catch. They tried to sink it in the river, but it washed back ashore the next morning. They could not get rid of it, so they hid it. They buried it in the foundation of the first town hall, which later became the library. They thought if they built a place of knowledge and reason on top of it, they could contain it, neutralize it." Elias stared at her, horrified. "They built my library on top of this thing. They thought they were protecting the town," Lena said. "But it seems all they did was give it a place to wait." She pointed a shaking finger at one of the architectural diagrams, the one of the library. "Look." Elias leaned closer. The drawing was unnervingly precise, down to the scuff marks on the floorboards. But he saw what she was pointing at. In the basement, in the far corner where the archives were, there was a doorway sketched in faint lines, a doorway that did not exist. "And what is this?" he asked, pointing to a series of symbols at the bottom of the page, beneath the drawing. "It is a warning," Lena breathed. "It says, it watches through the stone. It walks through the wood. It speaks through the silence." Suddenly, the lights in the shop flickered violently. A string of antique glass ornaments hanging from a beam began to swing, chiming discordantly. On a high shelf, a row of old apothecary bottles vibrated, and one of them, a cobalt blue bottle, slid forward and crashed to the floor, shattering into 1,000 pieces. Elias jumped back, his heart racing. Lena slammed the book shut. The flickering stopped. The shop fell silent, the only sound the faint tinkle of settling glass. What was that? Elias stammered. It does not like being read, Lena said, her face pale. It is awake, Elias. After all these years finding it, it has woken it up. She pushed the book across the table towards him. You need to put it back. Take it back to the library basement, put it on the shelf where you found it, and walk away. Pray that it goes back to sleep. Elias nodded dumbly, his mind reeling. He wrapped the book up, his hands clumsy. As he headed for the door, Lena's voice stopped him. Elias, there is one more part of the legend. They say the book does not just show the future, it feeds on it. It shows you a tragedy, and when that tragedy comes to pass, when it feeds on the fear and the grief, it grows stronger, and then it shows you another. The words hung in the air as Elias stepped back out into the deceptively bright afternoon. He felt dizzy, nauseous. He looked up, his gaze drawn inexorably towards the library at the other end of the square, towards the clock tower, and his blood ran cold. The hands of the clock were stopped. Both of them were pointing straight up, frozen at 12. But that was not right. He remembered looking at the clock just that morning, and it had been working fine. He squinted, trying to make out the details against the bright sky. Had they stopped at noon? No, it was later than that. He checked his watch. It was 3:33 in the afternoon. He looked back up at the clock tower. From this distance, it was hard to be sure, but he thought he saw a flicker of movement. A small, dark shape, standing on the narrow widow's walk that circled the top of the tower, just below the clock face. A shape that had no reason to be there. He broke into a run, stumbling across the town square, his lungs burning. Tourists and shoppers turned to stare. He did not care. He had to get back. He had to see. He burst through the library doors, startling Ben, who was half asleep at the desk. The library was mostly empty now, bathed in the long shadows of the late afternoon. It was quieter than before. The silence was no longer peaceful. It was predatory. He ignored Ben's startled questions and ran to the tall window in the reference room, the one that looked directly up at the clock tower. He stared up, his breath fogging the cool glass. The hands were indeed stopped, and there, on the widow's walk, was a figure. It was small and indistinct, silhouetted against the sky. A child. It was too far away to tell. But they were standing dangerously close to the edge. He remembered a page in the grimoire. He had not paid it much attention, distracted by the more grotesque anatomical drawings. But now he recalled it with sickening clarity. An illustration of the library's clock tower. In the drawing, the clock face was blank, the hands missing. and at the top, a small, dark figure stood on the edge, poised to fall. Panic was a physical thing. A hot, metallic vice squeezing Elias's chest. The image of the small figure on the widow's walk, silhouetted against the indifferent sky, was burned onto the back of his eyes. He stumbled back from the window, his breath coming in ragged, shallow gasps. "Elias, what is wrong?" Ben, the high school assistant, was standing by the reference desk, his face a mask of teenage concern. Elias could not form words. He just pointed a trembling finger at the window, at the tower that loomed over them. "Up there," he finally managed, his voice a dry rasp. "Someone is up there." On the walkway, he did not wait for a response. He pushed past the desk and ran towards his office, the canvas bag containing the grimoire slapping against his side. The key. He needed the key to the tower. It was kept on a special hook inside his key cabinet, a small brass key labelled simply "Tower." He had not touched it in years. The clock was serviced by a specialist from the next county over, a man who brought his own set of keys. There was never any other reason to go up there. His office, usually a haven of meticulous order, became a blur of frantic motion. He fumbled with the lock on the key cabinet, his fingers feeling thick and clumsy. The small door swung open. The hook was empty. "No," he whispered, a fresh wave of cold dread washing over him. He scanned the other hooks, his eyes darting back and forth. It was not there. He swept his hands across his desk, sending papers and pens scattering to the floor. Where was it? He had not moved it. He never moved it. Then he saw it, lying on his desk blotter, right in the center, where he could not possibly have missed it before. The small brass key. It had not been there a minute ago. He was sure of it. It was as if the book, the library, the whole town wanted him to go up there. It was clearing the path for him. He snatched the key and ran out of the office, past Ben's confused face, past the few patrons who looked up from their books with startled expressions. He saw Maya, the folklore student, rise from her table in the history section, her brow furrowed with worry. He ignored them all. The door to the tower stairs was at the back of the non-fiction section, a narrow, unassuming door that was always kept locked. Elias's hand shook as he jammed the key into the lock. It turned with a well-oiled click that sounded unnaturally loud in the silent library. He pulled the door open, revealing a spiral of stone steps that vanished into the darkness above. A gust of cold, musty air, smelling of ozone and dead pigeons, washed over him. He took the stairs 2 at a time, his footsteps echoing in the tight cylindrical space. The only light came from small, grime-caked slits in the stone, casting weak, distorted bars of grey across the steps. Cobwebs, thick as cotton, brushed against his face, and he flinched, wiping them away with a shudder. The silence was absolute. There was no hum of electricity, no distant traffic noise, not even the comforting monolithic tick-tock of the clock's mechanism. The silence was the most terrifying part. It was a dead silence, the silence of a tomb. He burst out into the clockroom, a dusty, cavernous space dominated by the immense, motionless brass gears of the clockwork. A great pendulum, the size of a man, hung perfectly still. It was here that the heart of the library should be beating, a steady, rhythmic pulse marking the passage of time for the whole town. But the heart had stopped. The air was thick with the dust of decades, each particle hanging motionless in the eerie twilight that filtered through the four great translucent faces of the clock. He saw the hatch, a small, iron-banded door set into the wall, leading out onto the widow's walk. He crossed the room, his shoes leaving clear prints in the thick layer of dust. He fumbled with the heavy iron latch, his fingers numb with cold and fear. He put his shoulder into it, and the heavy door groaned open, scraping against the stone floor. A blast of wind hit him, sharp and cold, tearing the breath from his lungs. He stepped out onto the narrow stone walkway, his knuckles white as he gripped the iron railing. The world fell away beneath him. The town square was a miniature map, the people tiny, moving specks. The height was dizzying, a physical blow that made his stomach lurch. The walkway was empty. He forced himself to move, shuffling sideways, his back pressed against the cold stone of the tower. He circled the entire circumference, his eyes scanning every inch. There was no one, no sign that anyone had been there. The stone was clean, save for a few patches of moss and the grime of a century of weather. There were no footprints in the dirt that had collected in the corners, no scuff marks, nothing. Had he imagined it? Was the stress, the lack of sleep, the book's insidious influence finally making him see things? He leaned against the railing, the wind whipping his hair across his face, and stared down at the town he had known his whole life. It looked different from up here. Fragile, vulnerable, a small island of light and order, surrounded by a vast, encroaching wilderness of dark woods. He looked at his watch. 3:45. He looked up at the clock face beside him. The great black hands were still frozen, pointing to 12. He reached out a hesitant hand and touched the minute hand. It was cold as ice. He gave it a gentle push. It did not move. It was completely rigid, as if it were welded in place. That was not right. Even stopped. There should have been some play in the mechanism. Then he saw it. Tucked into the corner where the stone wall met the walkway, almost hidden in shadow, was a small object. It was a child's toy, a little wooden soldier, its red paint faded and chipped. It was an old-fashioned toy, the kind he had not seen since he was a boy himself. He picked it up. The wood was smooth and cold. As he turned it over in his hand, a sense of profound and inexplicable grief washed over him, so sharp and sudden it was like a physical pain. He felt as if he had just lost something precious, something he could not name. He shoved the toy soldier into his pocket and stumbled back inside, pulling the heavy hatch door shut behind him, plunging the clockroom back into dusty darkness. The descent down the spiral stairs was worse than the climb. The adrenaline had been replaced by a hollow, trembling emptiness. He was not going mad. Someone or something had been up there. The book had shown him, and it had left a token behind. When he emerged from the stairwell door, blinking in the warm light of the library, Maya was waiting for him. "Mr. Thorne, are you all right?" she asked, her voice laced with genuine concern. "You ran out of here like the place was on fire." Elias struggled to compose himself, to smooth down his wind-blasted hair and slow his frantic breathing. "I am fine. I just thought I saw something. A maintenance issue with the clock." The lie tasted like ash in his mouth. Maya did not look convinced. "The clock stopped," she said, stating a fact. "I noticed it when I came in this morning. I thought it was strange." This morning, Elias felt a chill that had nothing to do with the wind on the tower. He was certain it had been working this morning. Had he been so consumed by his fear that his memory was already becoming unreliable? Or was time itself beginning to unravel? "It is an old mechanism," he said lamely. "It happens." He tried to walk past her, but she stepped in his path. "Mr. Thorne," she said, her voice lower now. "When I was looking for you, I saw the bag under your desk, the one you took to the curio shop." She hesitated. There was a book inside, bound in black. I only saw it for a second. Elias froze. "It is just a new acquisition. Very old. Fragile. I have been reading some of the old town records." She pressed on, her eyes intense. "The ones on microfilm. There are stories, legends about a book like that. They call it the Gloomwood Grimoire." Elias felt the floor drop out from under him. "You should not concern yourself with local superstitions, miss." "Maya," she supplied, "it is not just superstition, is it? I am researching vanishings, Mr. Thorne. Gaps in the town's history. The stories about the grimoire are always connected to those gaps. A tragedy would occur, something that could not be explained. A fire, a sudden plague, and then a whole family would disappear, or a section of the town records would be lost forever. It was as if the town itself was trying to forget, trying to erase the memory of what the book had done." Her words echoed Lena's warning. The book did not just predict tragedy, it fed on it. And then it erased the evidence. "You should go home," Elias said, his voice sharper than he intended. "This is not a safe place for you to be." A flicker of hurt crossed her face, followed by a look of stubborn resolve. "I think I can help." "You cannot," he said, his voice cracking. "No one can." "Please, just leave Havenwood." He turned and walked away, not waiting to see her reaction. He went straight to his office and locked the door. He slumped into his chair, his body trembling with exhaustion and fear. He pulled the wooden soldier from his pocket and set it on the desk. Its blank, painted eyes stared up at him. He took the grimoire from its bag. He opened it. The page with the drawing of the clock tower was subtly different. The silhouetted figure was gone. The drawing was now just an image of an empty tower with a blank clock face, as if the event had been consumed, digested. He flipped through the vellum pages, his heart pounding. A new illustration was coming into focus on a page that had previously been a meaningless swirl of brown ink. The lines were sharpening, bleeding into existence as he watched. It was a drawing of a bridge, the old covered bridge at the edge of town, over Black Creek. In the drawing, a car was stopped on the bridge. Its headlights were on, cutting through a thick, oppressive darkness. In front of the car, a figure stood in the beams of light. It was tall and unnaturally thin, its limbs too long, its form shrouded in what looked like rags. It had no discernible features, just a suggestion of a head, tilted at an impossible angle. He slammed the book shut, a strangled cry escaping his lips. It was showing him the next one, the next course in its gruesome feast. He had to do something. He could not just stand by and let this happen. He picked up the phone and dialed the sheriff's department. "Sheriff Brody, please, it is Elias Thorne. It is an emergency." A moment later, Brody's calm, unflappable voice came on the line. "Elias, what is the trouble?" Elias's words came out in a rush. "There was someone on the clock tower, a child, I think, and now they are gone. And the clock has stopped. Something is wrong, Sheriff, terribly wrong." There was a pause. "Elias, calm down. Are you sure you saw someone? The access door is always locked. I have a key. I went up there myself. They were gone, but they left something behind. A toy." Another pause, this one longer. Elias could picture Brody leaning back in his chair, rubbing his forehead. "A toy. Elias, it has been a stressful couple of days. Maybe you are just tired. Kids get into all sorts of places. Probably some teenagers playing a prank." "This was not a prank," Elias insisted, his voice rising. "This is connected to what happened to the dog. I am trying to tell you. Something is happening in this town." "Okay, Elias, okay," Brody said, his voice taking on the placating tone one uses with a hysterical child. "I will send a deputy to check out the tower, and I will have someone patrol the old bridge tonight, just in case. All right, now you go home and get some rest. Everything is going to be fine." Elias hung up the phone, his hand trembling with fury and despair. Brody did not believe him. He thought he was losing his mind. He was alone, utterly alone, utterly alone. He stayed in his office until closing time, the grimoire on the desk in front of him, a black, silent predator. He could feel its malevolent intelligence, its ancient, patient hunger. As the last of the evening light faded from the sky, the library sank into a deep gloom, the long aisles between the bookshelves becoming canyons of shadow. Just as he was about to leave, there was a soft knock on his office door. It was Maya. "I am sorry to bother you," she said, holding up a small square piece of microfilm, "but I found something. You said the clock stopped today. But I was right. It stopped this morning, and I think I know why." He let her in, a sense of grim resignation settling over him. "I was looking through the town archives from 1888, the year with the missing records," she said, her voice hushed with excitement and a trace of fear. "I found a brief article in the Havenwood Gazette from October of that year. It is about the clock tower. A maintenance worker fell from the Widow's Walk while trying to fix the clock hands, which had apparently frozen at exactly midnight. He died." Elias stared at her, the wooden soldier on his desk seeming to mock him. "That is not the strangest part," Maya continued, her voice dropping to a whisper. "There was a witness, a boy who was on the street below. He said the man was not alone up there. He said he saw another figure with him, a shadow man who had no hands. He said the shadow man pushed him. The official report dismissed it as the fantasy of a traumatized child. She looked at Elias, her eyes wide. The article is dated October 4th, 1888. That is today's date. Sov, 137 years ago, to the day. A floorboard creaked in the darkened library outside the office door. It was a loud, distinct sound, the sound of a heavy footstep. Elias and Maya both froze, their eyes locking in shared terror. The library was empty. He had locked the main doors himself 10 minutes ago. Another creak came from the main reading room. Closer this time. It was followed by a soft, sliding sound, the sound of a book being pulled from a shelf. The sound of the book sliding from the shelf was a violation. It was a small, intimate sound in a vast, dead space, and its intimacy was what made it so terrifying. Elias and Maya stood frozen in the dim light of the office, two statues carved from fear. The silence that followed was worse than the sound itself, a heavy, listening silence that pressed in on them, thick with malevolent attention. "Who is there?" Elias called out, the words catching in his dry throat. He was answered by nothing, not a footstep, not a whisper, not even the settling groan of the old building. There was only the charged stillness. "We have to get out of here," Maya whispered, her voice a strained thread of sound. She was right. The office, once a sanctuary, now felt like a cage. The locked door was no longer for keeping things out, but for keeping them in. Elias grabbed the canvas bag, the grimoire a leaden weight inside it. He took the wooden soldier from his desk and shoved it back into his pocket. The small, hard shape, a bizarre talisman against a formless dread. He moved to the office door, his hand hovering over the knob, his ear pressed to the wood. He could hear his own blood roaring in his ears, a frantic, pulsing rhythm. Beyond it, there was only the profound, unnatural quiet of the library. He turned the knob with agonizing slowness, wincing at the loud click of the latch. He pulled the door open a few inches and peered into the cavernous main room. The emergency lights cast a pale, sterile glow, creating pools of impenetrable darkness between the towering shelves. The library was a labyrinth of shadows, a place transformed from a repository of knowledge into a hunting ground. Nothing moved. "Stay behind me," he breathed, stepping out of the office. The air was colder here, carrying a faint charnel scent, like wet earth and spoiled meat. Each step he took on the polished floor seemed to echo into the high vaulted ceiling. Maya followed so closely behind him he could feel her trembling. They moved along the wall, using the circulation desk as cover. His eyes darted from aisle to aisle, expecting to see a figure standing there, a silhouette of impossible angles against the pale light, but there was nothing, only the silent waiting books, tens of thousands of them, tens of thousands of silent witnesses. Then he saw it. On a reading table in the center of the room, a single book lay open. It was directly under one of the emergency lights, deliberately placed, a piece of evidence left for them to find. He recognized the aisle it had come from, the children's section. A primal urge screamed at him to ignore it, to get to the main doors and flee into the night. but he could not. It was a message, a taunt. He approached the table slowly, Maya clutching the back of his jacket. It was a collection of nursery rhymes, its pages filled with faded, pastel illustrations of smiling animals and rosy-cheeked children. It was open to a specific page. The drawing showed a crooked man walking a crooked mile. But the illustration had been altered. A dark rust-brown ink, the same ink from the grimoire, had been used to draw over the picture. The crooked man's jaunty hat was now a featureless hood. His cane was a long skeletal finger pointing forward, and behind him a series of small, stick-like figures had been added, each one twisted and broken, lying along the crooked path. Beneath the rhyme, a single word had been scrawled in the same rusty ink, in the same spidery, inhuman script. Soon, a soft, wet scraping sound came from the far end of the library, from the deep shadows of the history section. This time they did not hesitate. They ran. They scrambled for the main entrance, their footsteps a frantic clatter in the silence. Elias fumbled with the locks, his fingers stiff and uncooperative. He finally managed to turn the deadbolt and yank the heavy oak door open. The night air that rushed in was shockingly cold, but it was clean. It was real. They stumbled out onto the library steps, and Elias slammed the door behind them. Not bothering to lock it, he leaned against the cold wood, gasping for breath, his heart feeling as if it would burst from his chest. The town square was deserted. The street lights cast a sickly orange glow on the damp pavement, the light seeming thin and fragile against the encroaching darkness of the night. What was that? What was in there? Maya asked, her voice shaking uncontrollably. I do not know, Elias said, though he suspected he did. The shadow man from the old story, the thing that had watched from the tower. It had a name, it had a shape, and it was no longer content to wait. He looked across the square. The lights were on in Sheriff Brody's office. He had to try again. He had to make him understand. Come on, he said, grabbing Maya's arm. They half walked, half ran across the empty square, the sound of their own footsteps unnervingly loud. The feeling of being watched was back, stronger than ever. The darkened windows of the shops and offices seemed to hold silent observers. The shadows in the alleyways seemed to deepen and shift as they passed. The town was no longer their own. It was a stage, and they were the only actors who did not know their lines. When they reached the sheriff's department, Elias pushed the door open without knocking. Brody was at his desk, a half-eaten sandwich in one hand, a phone receiver in the other. He looked up, his expression one of weary annoyance that quickly turned to alarm at the sight of their faces. "Call you back," he said into the phone and hung up. "Elias? What in God's name is going on?" "I sent Mills to check the tower, and he found the door unlocked, but there was nothing there. Now what?" "It was in the library," Elias said, the words tumbling out. "We were locked inside, and it was in there with us. It moved things. It left us a message." "Whoa, slow down," Brody said, standing up. "What was in there?" "A person. Did you get a look at them?" "It is not a person," Maya interjected, finding her voice. "Sheriff, my name is Maya. I am a researcher." The history of this town, it is not what you think it is. There are patterns, cycles of violence, and they are all connected to a book. The one Mr. Thorne found. Brody looked from Elias's wild eyes to Maya's pale, earnest face. He sighed, a deep, frustrated sound, and ran a hand through his thinning hair. A book. Elias, this is getting out of hand. You are scaring this young lady. You are scaring yourself. Sheriff, please, Elias begged, his composure cracking. He unslung the canvas bag and placed it on Brody's desk. Look at it. Just look at it. Brody stared at the bag for a long moment. Then, reluctantly, he reached in and pulled out the grimoire. He held it in his large, capable hands, turning it over. He ran a thumb over the smooth, black cover. Elias saw a flicker of something in his eyes, not belief, but a primal, instinctual revulsion. It is just an old book, Elias, he said, his voice lacking its earlier conviction. He opened it. He stared at the spidery script and the grotesque illustrations, his face hardening. He flipped through a few pages, his expression a mixture of disgust and bewilderment. All right, it is creepy, he admitted, closing it and pushing it back across the desk as if it were contaminated. Some kind of sick art project, maybe, but that does not mean it is haunted. It showed me what would happen to that dog, Elias insisted, his voice raw. It showed me the figure on the tower, and now it has shown me something else. A car on the old covered bridge at Black Creek, and a figure standing in front of it. You said you would send a patrol. Who did you send? Brody's face went rigid. The color drained from his cheeks. Deputy Mills, he said, his voice a hoarse whisper. I sent him to check the bridge on his way home. He stared at Elias. A new, terrible understanding dawning in his eyes. He grabbed his radio from its cradle on the desk. Dispatch. This is Brody. What is Mills's 20? Static crackled from the speaker. He checked in about 15 minutes ago, Sheriff. Said he was taking a look at the old bridge like you asked. I have not heard from him since. Try to raise him, Brody commanded, his voice tight. Deputy Mills, come in. Over. The dispatcher's voice squawked. They waited. The only sound in the office was the hiss of the radio. Deputy Mills, do you copy? More static. A heavy, suffocating silence filled the room. Brody grabbed his keys and his jacket. Stay here, he ordered them. Lock the door behind me. Do not open it for anyone. He was out the door before they could respond, his car roaring to life and peeling out of the town square, its red and blue lights flashing, cutting a frantic path through the darkness. Elias and Maya were left alone in the sterile light of the sheriff's office. The feeling of safety was gone. Brody's panic had validated their terror, given it an official seal. They were not mad. This was real. What do we do? Maya asked, wrapping her arms around herself. Elias looked at the grimoire on the desk. He felt a sickening pull towards it. He had to know. He had to see the page again. He opened it to the illustration of the bridge. The image was sharper now, more defined. He could see the make of the car. It was a police cruiser. He could see the number on the side. It was 3. Brody's fleet only had 3 cars. The figure in front of it was clearer. It was impossibly tall and gaunt, its limbs bent at angles that bones should not allow. Its head was tilted so far to the side it seemed it must be broken. It was wrapped in dark, tattered rags that fluttered in an unseen wind, and where its face should be, there was only a smooth, pale blankness. "We have to go," Elias said suddenly. "What?" "Brody told us to stay here. He is going there alone," Elias said, a terrible urgency gripping him. "He does not know what he is dealing with. We saw it in the book. We have to warn him." It was an irrational thought, born of desperation. What could they possibly do? But the idea of waiting here, helpless, while the book's prophecy came to pass, was unbearable. He grabbed the book, and they ran out into the night, following the fading trail of the sheriff's sirens. The old covered bridge was 2 miles out of town, a relic from another century that was rarely used anymore. The main highway bypassed it completely. It was an isolated, forgotten place. They ran until their lungs burned and their legs ached, the cold night air a knife in their throats. The farther they got from the lights of the town, the darker the world became. The moon was a sliver hidden behind a thick veil of clouds. The road was a black ribbon unwinding into a deeper blackness. The woods on either side were a solid wall of shadow, alive with the rustle of unseen things. They heard the creak before they saw the bridge, a low, constant murmur of water over rock. Then, around a final bend, they saw it. The bridge was a long, dark tunnel, a gaping mouth in the night. And just as the drawing had shown, a police cruiser was stopped in the center of it, its headlights cutting 2 perfect, unwavering beams through the gloom. The engine was running, the flashing lights on the roof were still on, painting the interior of the bridge in silent, strobing bursts of red and blue. But the car was empty. The driver's side door was wide open. Sheriff Brody's car was parked on the side of the road, its own headlights illuminating the entrance to the bridge. He was standing there, his gun drawn, shouting into the darkness, "Mills, answer me. Deputy Mills." His voice was swallowed by the oppressive silence. Elias and Maya slowed, approaching cautiously. Brody heard them and spun around, his weapon raised for a terrifying second before he recognized them. "I told you to stay in town," he snarled, his face a grim mask of fear and fury. "We saw it in the book," Elias said, panting. "We had to come." Brody's eyes were fixed on the empty cruiser inside the bridge. "His radio is dead. I can't get a signal. He's not in the car." "He is just gone." A sound echoed from the far end of the bridge, a soft dragging sound, the sound of something heavy being pulled across the old wooden planks. All 3 of them froze. Brody aimed his flashlight into the dark maw of the bridge, its beam cutting a sharp, nervous circle. The dragging sound stopped. "Stay here," Brody whispered, and began to walk slowly towards the cruiser, his gun held in a 2-handed grip. Elias and Maya watched from the entrance, their hearts hammering. The strobing red and blue lights gave the scene a surreal, nightmarish quality. Brody reached the empty car. He swept his light across the interior. Nothing. He shone it on the floor of the bridge. "Oh, God," he breathed, his voice coming back to them as a horrified whisper. He knelt, Elias could not see what he was looking at, but he saw Brody's shoulders sag. When the sheriff stood up, he backed away from the car slowly, his face ashen in the flashing lights. He had seen something that had broken him. That was when the figure appeared. It emerged from the darkness at the far end of the bridge, stepping into the unwavering beams of the cruiser's headlights. It was exactly as it had been in the grimoire, impossibly tall, impossibly thin. Its long, tattered arms hung almost to its knees. Its head was canted at a sickening angle, a pale, featureless oval. It did not walk. It seemed to glide, to flow across the wooden planks, its movements jerky and unnatural, like a marionette with its strings cut. It made no sound. Sheriff Brody fired his gun. The shot was a deafening crack that echoed through the night. The figure did not flinch. It did not slow. Another shot, and another. The bullet seemed to pass through it, having no effect. It raised one of its long, thin arms and pointed a finger, a long white shard that looked more like bone than flesh, at Brody, and the headlights on the cruiser went out, plunging the bridge into absolute darkness, broken only by the frantic, silent strobing of the roof lights. In one flash of red, the figure was 20 feet from Brody. In the next flash of blue, it was 10. "Run!" Brody screamed, his voice thick with terror. He turned and sprinted towards them. "Get out of here! Run!" Elias grabbed Maya's hand and pulled her back, stumbling away from the bridge. He glanced over his shoulder. In a flash of red light, he saw Sheriff Brody reach the entrance of the bridge. In the next flash of blue, he saw the creature, right behind him, its long arm reaching out. Then all the lights went out, the cruisers, Brody's car, everything. They were plunged into a profound and total blackness. They heard one last choked scream, and then silence. Only the soft murmur of the creek below. Silence. The scream was gone, swallowed by the night as if it had never been. The darkness that had consumed the lights was a physical presence, a thick, suffocating blanket that muted all sound, all thought. For a heartbeat, Elias and Maya stood paralyzed, their lungs locked, their minds refusing to process the finality of that sound. Brody was gone. The law, the authority, the last vestige of the ordered world they knew had been snuffed out. Then came the noise that broke the spell, a wet tearing sound from the direction of the bridge, followed by a soft, heavy thump. It was a sound of finality, a sound of consumption. "Run!" Elias gasped, the single word, a shard of glass in his throat. He grabbed Maya's wrist, his grip surprisingly strong, and pulled her away from the road, away from the bridge, away from the unseen horror that was unfolding in the blackness. They did not run towards the town. The road was a clear path, an open invitation. Instinct, primal and absolute, drove them sideways, off the asphalt and into the treacherous, uneven ground of the forest. They plunged into the gloomwood. The canopy of ancient trees closed over them instantly, cutting off the faint silvery light of the clouded moon, making the absolute darkness of the road seem like twilight in comparison. Branches whipped at their faces like skeletal hands. Thorny vines tore at their clothes and skin. The forest floor was a chaotic tangle of roots, slick with damp moss, that seemed deliberately placed to catch their feet and send them sprawling. They ran blindly, fueled by pure, unthinking terror. They fell. They scrambled back up. They pushed through dense thickets of undergrowth that clawed at them like living things. Their breath came in painful, searing sobs. Every snap of a twig under their own feet sounded like the pursuit behind them. Every rustle of leaves in the wind was the whisper of its rags. There was no sound of pursuit. That was the most terrifying part. They could hear their own frantic, clumsy flight, the crashing of their bodies through the brush, the ragged tearing of their own breathing. But behind them, there was nothing. The creature did not need to run. The woods were its home. It could move through them as silently as the shadows it commanded. The silence was not an absence of the creature. It was the presence of it, all around them, watching, waiting, pacing them with an effortless, predatory grace. "I cannot," Maya gasped, stumbling to a halt and leaning against the rough bark of an immense oak. "Elias, I cannot." Elias stopped, his chest heaving, his own legs trembling with exhaustion. He listened, straining his ears against the sound of his own hammering heart. The woods were quiet, too quiet. There were no crickets, no calls of night birds, no rustle of small animals in the undergrowth. The entire forest was holding its breath. "We have to keep moving," he urged, his voice a raw whisper. "It knows where we are." As if in answer, a sound drifted through the trees from the direction they had come. It was not a footstep or a snarl. It was a voice. Sheriff Brody's voice. "Elias? Maya? It is all right. It is gone. I scared it off." The voice was a perfect imitation. Calm, reassuring, sane. It was a lure cast into the darkness, a hook baited with hope. Maya let out a small, choked sob and pressed herself tighter against the tree, her eyes wide with terror. "Do not listen," Elias breathed, grabbing her arm again. "It is a trick." "Lost my flashlight," the voice called again. "Closer now. Damn thing is slippery. Just give a shout. Let me know where you are." They started moving again, trying to be quieter now, their blind panic replaced by a more focused, deliberate dread. They crept from tree to tree, using the massive trunks for cover, moving deeper into the forest's black heart. The voice followed them. It did not get louder, it just moved. Sometimes it was to their left, sometimes to their right. It was herding them. "You should not have come, Elias," the voice said, its tone shifting, losing its reassuring edge and taking on a note of cold amusement. "You should have left the book where you found it. It was sleeping so peacefully." Elias stumbled over a root, the canvas bag swinging from his shoulder and hitting the ground with a soft thud. He froze. The voice stopped. The silence stretched, taut and thin. A new sound began, the soft, dry rustle of turning pages. It came from all around them at once, a whispering, papery caress in the darkness. It was the sound of the grimoire, amplified and echoed by the woods themselves. It was the sound of their fate being written. They ran. All pretense of stealth was gone. They crashed through the woods, away from the impossible sound, their only only goal was to put distance between themselves and the voice, the whispers, the suffocating presence that was toying with them. The terrain grew steeper, sloping downwards into a gully. They half ran, half slid down the muddy embankment, landing in a heap at the bottom among wet, decaying leaves that released a smell of rich, black earth. For a moment, there was only the sound of their own frantic breathing. The rustling of pages had stopped. The voice was gone. They had a reprieve. Elias fumbled in his pocket, his fingers closing around the small, hard shape of the wooden soldier. It offered no comfort. They followed the gully, hoping it would lead them somewhere, anywhere. The ground was marshy, and their shoes sank into the cold mud with every step. The air grew damp and heavy. After what felt like an eternity of cautious, stumbling progress, they saw it. A shape in the darkness, a black rectangle against the slightly less black tapestry of the trees. A building. It was a small, dilapidated cabin, barely more than a shed. It sagged to one side, its roofline askew, its windows black, vacant squares. It was a place of decay and neglect, but it had 4 walls and a door. It was shelter. They crept towards it, every sense on high alert. The cabin was silent. The door hung slightly ajar on a single groaning hinge. Elias pushed it open. The smell that billowed out was of rot and damp, and the musky scent of animals that had long since abandoned it. He took a hesitant step inside, then another. Maya followed, her hand gripping the back of his shirt. He closed the door behind them, and the flimsy wood seemed to offer a profound, if illusory, sense of security. He found a thick piece of fallen timber inside and wedged it against the door, barricading them in. The darkness inside the cabin was total. "Do you have a phone?" Elias whispered, his voice sounding small and thin in the enclosed space. "No." Maya's voice trembled beside him. "I left it at the library." "Of course. The library. A whole lifetime ago." He fumbled in his pockets. Matches. He had a small box of emergency matches in his coat. His fingers, numb and clumsy, finally managed to pry the box open. He struck one. The flare of light was blinding, making them both flinch. In the brief, flickering yellow glare, they saw their surroundings. The cabin was a single room, empty save for a scattering of debris, a rusted wood stove in the corner, and a crude wooden table. The walls were stained with water and creeping mold. On the floor, near the stove, was a small, desiccated pile of what looked like animal bones. The match burned his fingers, and he dropped it, plunging them back into darkness. He lit another. This time his eyes adjusted more quickly. He saw something on the table, a candle, half melted in a saucer of its own hardened wax. He touched the flame of the match to the old wick. It sputtered, then caught, casting a weak, dancing circle of light. It was not much, but it was a shield. It pushed the absolute darkness back into the corners. They slumped down against the wall, their backs to the barricaded door, their bodies shaking with a mixture of cold, exhaustion, and residual terror. The small, flickering flame of the candle was their entire world. "What was that thing?" Maya asked, her voice barely audible over the chattering of her own teeth. I think it is the book," Elias said, his gaze falling to the canvas bag at his feet. "Not just from the book. I think it is the book, its guardian, its appetite." He pulled the grimoire from the bag. He did not want to open it. He was terrified of what he might see. But not knowing was worse. Not knowing was ceding control. He placed it on the floor between them, and with a trembling hand, opened the cover. The page with the drawing of the bridge was almost blank now. The ink faded to a faint, ghostly stain. He turned the page. A new image was forming, the rusty brown lines bleeding into the vellum like a fresh wound. He held the book closer to the candlelight, his blood turning to ice in his veins. The drawing was of a small, dilapidated cabin. It showed the rusted stove in the corner. It showed a single candle burning on a table. And it showed two small, huddled figures, their faces blank with terror, their backs against a barricaded door. A soft, deliberate tap came from the other side of that door. They both jumped, their heads snapping towards the sound. Maya stifled a scream, pressing her knuckles to her mouth. The tap came again, a gentle, almost polite rapping, like a visitor on a Sunday afternoon. Elias stared at the drawing in the book. It was changing. Outside the cabin, a new shape was being drawn into existence. A tall, gaunt figure. Its head was tilted at a broken angle. It was standing just outside the door. In the drawing, one of its long, bone-like fingers was extended, touching the wood. Tap, tap, tap. The sound was a perfect match for the drawing. The book was not predicting the future. It was narrating the present. It was a play-by-play of their own demise. "Do not make a sound," Elias whispered, his eyes locked on the door. The tapping stopped. The silence that followed was heavy with anticipation. Elias watched the doorknob, a simple, tarnished brass knob. It began to turn, slowly, back and forth. A quarter turn to the right, a quarter turn to the left. The mechanism inside the lock made a soft, metallic scraping sound. It was toying with them. It was feeding on the thick, rich terror that was pouring off them in waves. Lena's words came back to him. It feeds on fear and grief. It makes it stronger. They were powering it. Their panic was a feast. The doorknob stopped turning. There was a long, drawn-out moment of silence. Then, with a sudden, explosive crack, the wood of the doorframe just beside the knob splintered inwards. A single long white finger, as pale and sharp as a shard of porcelain, poked through the hole. It wiggled, exploring the air, then retreated. Maya let out a choked gasp. Elias grabbed her hand, his mind racing. They were trapped. The window was boarded up from the outside. There was no other way out. The creature was no longer being subtle. A heavy rhythmic thump started against the door. It was the sound of a shoulder being thrown against the wood. The whole cabin shook with each impact. The piece of timber he had used as a barricade bowed inwards, groaning in protest. Splinters of wood flew from the door. Elias looked at the book in his hands, its hateful pages illuminated by the guttering candlelight. It was the source. It was the cause. The settlers had tried to burn it, to sink it. They could not destroy it. But maybe it could be unwritten. It was a mad thought, born of sheer desperation. He flipped through the pages, past the horrors it had already shown them. past the anatomical grotesqueries and the impossible architecture. He was looking for something. A blank page. An ending. The thumping grew louder, more frantic. The barricade was splintering. He found it, near the back. A single page that was completely empty. No lines, no swirls, just the clean, creamy white of the vellum. Without thinking, without a plan, he acted. He took the wooden soldier from his pocket. It was old, the paint chipped, the wood was hard, seasoned. He pressed the sharp corner of its base against the blank page and, with all the force of his terror and despair, he dragged it across the surface. He was trying to tear the page, to defile it, to wound the book in the only way he could. The moment the toy soldier touched the page, a soundless scream erupted in his mind, a wave of pure, concentrated malice that made him recoil. The grimoire fell from his hands. The candle flame leaped to a prodigious height, then was instantly snuffed out, plunging them into absolute darkness once more. The pounding on the door stopped. In the sudden ringing silence, they heard a new sound, a high-pitched, unearthly shriek that came from just outside the cabin. It was a sound of agony and rage, a sound that scraped at the inside of their skulls. It was not human, it was not animal. It was the sound of something ancient and impossible being hurt. The shrieking faded, replaced by a frantic crashing sound that receded into the woods. It sounded as if a great panicked beast was fleeing, breaking branches and tearing through the undergrowth in its desperate retreat. Then silence, a real silence this time. The crickets started to chirp. Somewhere in the distance an owl hooted. The forest was breathing again. They waited in the suffocating darkness, not daring to move, for what felt like hours. Elias finally found the courage to strike another match. In its flickering light, he saw the cabin was as it had been. The door was shattered, hanging from one hinge, the barricade a pile of splintered wood. But it was gone. The grimoire lay on the floor where it had fallen, open to the blank page, a long, deep scratch, a raw wound, now marred its perfect surface, where he had gouged it with the toy. He picked it up. He did not know how or why, but his desperate symbolic act of defiance had driven the creature away. For now, he helped Maya to her feet. They were both shaking, covered in mud and scratches, but they were alive. They stumbled out of the ruined cabin into the pre-dawn gloom. The sky to the east was a faint bruised purple. The nightmare was almost over, at least for tonight. They staggered through the woods, following the growing light until they broke through the tree line and onto a familiar stretch of road. In the distance, they could see the soft, hazy glow of Havenwood streetlights. They had survived, but as Elias looked back at the dark, menacing wall of the gloomwood, he clutched the wounded book to his chest and knew this was not an ending. He had not won. He had only rung the dinner bell. He had shown the book and the ancient hungry thing that served it that he was not just passive prey, he was a threat, and now the hunt would truly begin. Dawn did not bring relief. It came as a slow, clinical drain of colour from the sky, a shift from impenetrable black to a bruised and sullen grey. The light did not warm. It exposed. It illuminated the grime caked under their fingernails, the dark weeping scratches on their faces and hands, the mud that clung to them like a second skin. They looked like creatures who had crawled out of their own graves. They did not speak as they walked the last half-mile into Havenwood. There were no words for the things they had seen, for the silence where Sheriff Brody's life used to be. The town, just waking up, looked alien and obscene in its normality. A baker unlocked his shop, the smell of fresh bread a grotesque parody of comfort. A man collected his newspaper from his lawn, oblivious to the fact that the town's protector lay broken and consumed in a dark wooden tunnel just 2 miles away. The world had kept turning, ignorant of the fact that its axis had been shattered. Their first and only destination was Lena Petrova's curios shop. They looked like ghosts at her door, and when she opened it, her face, already etched with worry, crumpled into a mask of grim understanding. She ushered them inside without a word, locked the door behind them, and led them to the small apartment she kept above the shop. While Maya showered, scrubbing at the filth and the memory of the forest, Elias sat at Lena's small kitchen table, the canvas bag containing the grimoire on the floor beside him. He could feel its presence, a low, triumphant hum. It was sated, fed, stronger. He placed the small wooden soldier on the table, its chipped paint a stark splash of colour in the grey morning light. Lena placed a steaming mug of tea in front of him. Her hands were steady, but her eyes were full of a deep, ancient sorrow. "Brody?" she asked softly. Elias just shook his head, unable to speak past the lump in his throat. "I heard the sirens," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "I knew. The book. It is fully awake now, is not it?" "We heard it," Elias said, his voice a hoarse croak. He told her about the cabin, about his desperate act of scratching the blank page with the toy soldier. It ran. It shrieked. Lena's eyes widened with a flicker of something that was not quite hope, but a keen academic interest. "The soldier. Where did you find it?" "On the clock tower." "May I see it?" He pushed it across the table. Lena picked it up with a reverence that seemed absurd for such a simple toy. She turned it over and over, her thumb tracing the faded paint. "This wood," she murmured. "It is ironwood, rowan some call it, an old ward against evil. But that is not the important part." She pointed to a tiny, almost invisible mark carved into the base. It was a simple shape, a circle with a vertical line running through it. "It is a maker's mark," she explained, "the mark of Silas Croft. He was a toy maker here in Havenwood in the late 1800s. His son, Thomas, was the boy who witnessed the maintenance worker fall from the tower in 1888, the boy who claimed a shadow man pushed him." The pieces clicked into place with a horrifying resonance. A father's grief, a child's terror, carved into a piece of protective wood, an object imbued with a profound human story. "The book is a collection of stories," Elias said, his mind racing. "It consumes them. But this is a story it could not eat. It is a story of defiance, When I used it on the page, I was not just scratching the vellum, I was writing back. When Maya emerged, clean, but with a haunted, hollowed-out look in her eyes that Elias knew would never leave, the three of them sat around the table. The grimoire lay between them, a silent, brooding monarch. They were its subjects, its playthings, but now they understood a fraction of its rules. "We cannot destroy it," Lena said, her voice flat with certainty. "The first settlers proved that, and now it is stronger than it has been in a century. It will not go back to sleep on its own." "So what do we do?" Maya asked, her voice trembling. "We cannot just let it keep feeding. It is tied to this place," Elias said, his eyes fixed on the black cover. "It was born of the gloomwood. It was contained in the library's foundation. It does not belong out in the world. Its story is here." He looked at Lena, a terrible, dawning resolution in his eyes. "We have to put it back." "Back in the archives?" Lena asked, her brow furrowed. "Elias, it will just wait. Another 50 years, another 100. Someone else will find it. This will all happen again." "No," Elias said softly. "Not just back on the shelf. The settlers contained it by building a library on top of it. They created a larger story, a story of knowledge and reason, to smother its dark one. But they left the book alone, unattended." He paused, the final horrifying piece of the puzzle sliding into place. A library needs a librarian. A collection needs a keeper. Maya and Lena stared at him, not understanding at first. Then, as the meaning of his words settled, horror dawned on their faces. "Elias, no," Maya whispered. "You cannot. It needs a story to feed on," he continued, his voice calm, his logic an island of terrible sanity in a sea of madness. "It will always need one. That is its nature. So I will give it one. A story that never ends." "You would be its prisoner," Lena protested, her composure finally breaking. "I would be its guardian," he corrected gently. "A story of a quiet man who found a book and never left its side. A story so dull, so unchanging, it will starve the creature that serves it. It will put the book back to sleep, with me as its jailer." It was a librarian's solution, the ultimate act of curation. To take the most dangerous book in the world and personally reshelve it, forever. He had spent his life in the quiet company of stories. It was a grim, poetic justice that he should become one. There was no more argument. In the face of his quiet, unshakable resolve, their protests died. They knew he was right. It was the only way. They waited until the deep of the night. The town was a jittery hive of activity. State police cars had arrived, their presence a stark intrusion of the outside world. The search for Sheriff Brody and his deputy had begun. Elias and Maya, as the last people to see him, would be questioned. Their time was short. Under the cover of a moonless sky, they slipped back to the library. The main doors were still unlocked, a silent testament to their frantic escape. Inside, the building felt different. The malevolent presence was gone, but the silence was heavier, weighted with memory. They walked to the door to the tower stairs, the one that led to the archives in the sub-basement. Elias held the grimoire, its skin-like cover, cool and strangely pliant against his fingers. He stopped and turned to Maya. "They will ask you what happened," he said, his voice even. "Tell them Brody was chasing a lead, that he told you to run and hide. Tell them you do not know anything else. Stick to the story." Tears streamed down her face, silent and silver in the gloom. "I cannot just leave you here." "You must," he said, his voice softening. "Someone has to live. Someone has to be the story that gets away." He reached into his pocket and pulled out the small wooden soldier. He pressed it into her hand and closed her fingers around it. "A story of defiance," he said. "Keep it safe." He turned to Lena. "Thank you." Lena, her face a mask of grief, simply nodded. "Godspeed, Elias Thorne." He took a deep breath and walked through the door, closing it softly behind him, leaving the two women in the dim light of the library. He descended into the darkness, not with the frantic terror of the night before, but with the steady, measured tread of a man walking to his own self-appointed execution. The basement was cold as a crypt. The smell of damp earth and mildew was thick in the air. He walked to the forgotten corner of the archives, to the low shelf behind the old tax ledgers. The space where the book had rested for a century was waiting for it. He held the grimoire, this nexus of all their pain and terror, and prepared to place it back. A flicker of movement in the deepest shadows of the corner made him pause. The creature was there. It did not glide forward this time. It did not glide forward this time. It simply resolved. A column of darkness that coalesced into the impossibly tall, gaunt figure. Its head was tilted, its featureless face a pale oval in the gloom. It did not threaten, it did not move, it simply watched him, it waited. This was the final test. It was offering him a choice. He could put the book back and walk away. He could leave it for another to find. He could have his life back. A life of quiet days and sunlit rooms, and the simple pleasure of a good cup of tea. He thought of the dog under the oak tree. He thought of the terror in Sheriff Brody's final scream. He thought of Maya with her haunted eyes and the lifetime of nightmares that lay ahead of her. He looked at the creature, this personification of the book's hunger, and he felt not fear, but a profound, weary pity. He clutched the book to his chest and took a step away from the shelf, towards the deepest, darkest corner of the archives. He sat down on the cold, damp floor, his back against the stone foundation of the library, and pulled his knees to his chest, cradling the grimoire like a sleeping child. He was not just returning the book to the shelf. He was the shelf. He was the lock. He was the final, unread chapter. He looked at the creature and gave a small, almost imperceptible nod. An acceptance, a final, binding contract. The figure seemed to waver, to dissolve at the edges like smoke. And as Elias closed his eyes, he felt a profound cold seep into him. A silence that went deeper than sound. It was the silence of forgotten words, of stories ending, of a final page being turned. The world outside, with its sunlight and its seasons and its sorrows, faded into a distant, meaningless echo. Upstairs, Maya and Lena felt it, a subtle shift in the atmosphere of the building. A deep, resonant hum faded into a perfect, peaceful quiet. The library was still. The book was home. They left, locking the great oak doors behind them. The next morning, a new librarian was temporarily assigned from the county. The old one, Elias Thorne, had simply vanished. He became another one of Havenwood's gaps. Another story that just stopped. But Maya knew the truth. Sometimes, late at night, when the autumn wind rattles her window, she takes out the small wooden soldier and looks towards the town square. She looks at the dark, silent library, a great stone mausoleum of stories, and she knows that in its deepest, coldest heart, Elias Thorne is still on duty. A quiet man, sitting in the dark, forever at his post, the steadfast, eternal keeper of the gloom. For the Havenwood Library was a place of stories. Elias Thorne, its most dedicated librarian, had finally become one